The EMD AEM-7, and I'm just going to call it the AEM because I'm not saying -7 every single time, was an electric locomotive built for Amtrak, specifically to replace the bitter failure that was the GE-E60. The AEMs were an exceptional piece of work for Amtrak. Alongside the F40PHs, the AEMs became the backbone of the nationalized passenger rail line in America. They were operated mostly in the Northeast Corridor and the Keystone Corridor, as those were the major electrified portions of Amtrak's lines. Two other companies also saw use for the AEMs. Both MARC and SEPTA have utilized them effectively as well. They're reliable, they're very fast, and this is one of those times, and I don't think this has happened quite yet, where I can actually discuss these locomotives from personal experience. See, I have ridden on multiple trains that were pulled by AEMs. And I can tell you, they are a smooth ride for the passengers. I've had good experiences on Amtrak all around myself, and the AEMs were a big part of that. Sadly, they have been retired in recent years. Amtrak retired them in 2016, MARC did it in 2017, and SEPTA in 2018. Their last run was December 1st, 2018. 2 units were sold to Caltrain. The SEPTA and MARC units are still stored, and 2 of the Amtrak units got preserved. The remainder, however, have been scrapped. Still, they've been running on the rails since the late 70s, and that's a pretty good run for an electric locomotive in the modern age. It's also worth mentioning they were actually based on the Swedish RC4s. So, hey, thanks Sweden! The General Electric 44-ton switcher. These little devils were built between 1940 and 1956. They were designed for industrial and light switching duties, and they actually replaced some steam locomotives that had previously done those jobs. They were efficient and strong for their size, but I bet you're wondering, why 44 tons? That seems oddly specific, and yes, it was. See, these were designed specifically to circumvent a union issue. When diesel started coming into the fray, replacing steam locomotives, railroad unions were trying to preserve firemen's jobs. Because technically speaking, a diesel didn't actually require a second person to be in the cab necessarily. In 1937, what was called the 90,000-pound rule was introduced, and it stipulated specifically that any locomotive weighing 90,000 pounds or more, or 45 short tons, would be required to have a fireman regardless of whether it was a diesel or really anything. If it was that heavy, it was getting a fireman, period. So the railroads were like, oh okay, well we'll do that. We could play that game. So they specifically requested a switcher diesel that weighed less than the 45 short tons. Hence, the 44-ton switcher was created. And they were very good, very impressive little pieces of work, and served for a great deal of time. Not just in North America, but Australia, Saudi Arabia, South America, India, France, Sweden, all over the place these little guys operated. And many are still preserved, so you may have actually seen one at a Heritage Railway Museum. The London and North Eastern Railway Gresley classes A1 and A3. These have been a consistent request for this list for a while, and believe me, I get it. The reason I put 2 different classes in the same category is that they were basically the same thing. The A3s were just an improvement of the A1s, and most of the A1s actually wound up being converted to A3s. Designed by the legendary Sir Nigel Gresley and built between 1922 and 1935, these Pacifics were an incredible achievement for British rail lines back in the day. They were fast, they were powerful, and they served the railways for years, with the last one, number 60052, not being withdrawn until January of 1966. They are a much beloved locomotive by British rail fans, and with good reason. They were amazing. And while the vast majority of the class was scrapped, fortunately, 60103, known as the Flying Scotsman, which was withdrawn in 1963, was preserved at the National Railway Museum in York, so you can still see one of Sir Nigel Gresley's crowning achievements for yourself. The New York Central Hudson. 464, which became known as the Hudson type in America, was probably most famous for its role on the New York Central Railroad. There were actually several different models, J1, J2, and J3, all built between 1927 and 1938. A total of 275 were produced, and these were the beacons of New York Central for years. They were famous for pulling some of their best passenger trains, like the 20th Century Limited and the Empire State Express, but they were actually great for freight duties too. They're probably most famous in their distinctive streamlining phase, but this could be removed, revealing a more typical looking steam locomotive. But don't let that fool you. These things could travel up to at least 123 miles per hour, or 198 kilometers an hour. And they probably could have gone faster, but due to speed restrictions, they never actually pushed them beyond that officially. They served for decades, but sadly every single one would be scrapped by the late 1950s. The only exception is one of their tenders, which belonged to J1D 5313. It was converted to a steam heat car, and is preserved at the Steamtown National Historic Site. It's a shame that none of the actual Hudsons were kept, because they were a phenomenal piece of technical prowess. The British Rail Standard Class 9F. Yep, that's about right. Built between 1954 and 1960, very late in the era of steam locomotives, the Class 9F is considered by some to be the ultimate steam locomotive when it comes to British rail lines. These things were amazing. They were huge, 210-0s, but they didn't really lose any efficiency despite their great size, and they were capable of hauling both freight and passenger services effectively. Despite only operating for a brief period of time, they were a common sight for rail fans of that era, and the last one of this class, number 92220 Evening Star, was actually the final steam locomotive that was built by British Railways in 1960. However, they couldn't escape the impending modernization plan that saw fit to remove every single steam locomotive operated by British Rail and replace it with diesels, a lot of which were actually more terrible than the steam locomotives they were meant to replace. The last one was withdrawn in 1968, which was the last year of steam traction on British lines. But fortunately, 9 examples of this amazing locomotive survived into preservation, and a few of which are actually in running condition. So if you're ever in the UK, it's still possible to go and appreciate what some consider to be the ultimate locomotive in British steam development. I look forward to people debating that in the comments. But either way, the 9Fs are great. The PKP Class EP07. I've always tried to keep things Mr. Worldwide over here, but I understand that many of you have pointed out that there are many other countries that I have not yet discussed. And I have talked about Poland recently, but I haven't talked about the EP07s. These are a class of standard gauge electric locomotives that were mainly used for passenger trains, and by mainly used I mean still used now. PKP Intercity is a long-distance passenger transport service that runs over in Poland, and they've used the EP07s since about 1995. They're actually rebuilds though. Originally they were the EU07, which was originally built in 1965. They were modified enough to have a new designation, but they are still remarkably similar to that original EU07. The longevity of the design shouldn't be understated, as they are incredibly good electric locomotives. They're reliable, capable of 78 miles per hour, 125 kilometers per hour, with a tractive effort of about 62,950 pounds. That's 280 kilonewtons. They've gone through a couple modernizations over the last couple decades, but they're still pretty much the same locomotive as was modified in 1995. And even there, they weren't all that different from their original form from 1965. Poland really likes keeping things around and modernizing, and, they do a good job at it. These are genuinely good locomotives that are doing the work. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if you can just fix it, don't replace it. That's kind of where we're at with it right now. The NZR KB class. This was a group of 6 mixed traffic locomotives built for the New Zealand Railways. There we go. See, Mr. Worldwide, I told you. They're 484s, which would make them Northerns. They were given interesting squarish streamlining, but this was not done necessarily because they wanted them to be streamlined in the radical sense. They didn't much care about that when they built them in 1939, but as originally built, they were given ACFI feedwater systems, and that was pretty state-of-the-art, but people hated it because it looked gross. They just felt it didn't look nice, which is an interesting thing to complain about, but then again, modern rail fans complain about how locomotives look all the time, so I'm not entirely surprised by this. Both the KBs and the KAs, actually, were fitted with shrouding and streamlining specifically to hide the ACFI system. The aesthetic shrouding worked to clean up the appearance of them, but it was actually open at the top where it could gather soot and dust. After the war, the aesthetic shrouding was actually removed entirely, and the ACFI Speedwater system was replaced with an exhaust steam injector instead. That being said, despite so few of them being built, they were actually really good, genuinely so. They were reliable and pretty fast by New Zealand standards of that era, though they were introduced pretty late in terms of the steam age. Despite this, they lasted until 1968. That's when the last one ran. But there is one still in preservation, and it was only there out of sheer luck thanks to rail fans. See, NCR did donate members of the regular Ks as well as the KAs for preservation, but since the KBs were so similar, they didn't bother donating one of them, but enthusiasts purchased one at the scrap market rate, thereby saving KB 968, who was supposed to be cut up a week after her last excursion. She is currently undergoing restoration to mainline operating condition at Mainline Steam's Christchurch Depot. So despite being the last of her kind, it seems like she's getting a happy ending at the very least, for an incredible piece of New Zealand technology. The British Rail Class 47. Son of a... I'm not allowed to say bad words here. This is supposed to be fairly family-friendly, and you are ruining it! The Class 47s, or Brush Type 4, is a diesel-electric that was developed in the 1960s by Brush Traction. Now, you'd think, saying that means they'd be really bad, because it's 1960s during the modernization plan and it's a diesel-electric, but this is one of the ones that worked out. 47s actually turned out to be pretty good. Genuinely so. Brush did a really good job with them. 512 wound up being produced between 1962 and 1968. With a speed of 75 miles per hour, 121 kilometers per hour, an attractive effort of 55,000 pounds, 245 kilonewtons, these were impressive and actually usable diesel electrics for British Rail. They could actually, utilize them, put them on the rails and expect them to run without too much difficulty at all. In fact, they were so good that, and I can't believe this, they are still in service now. Yes, really. Quite a few, in fact. 32 are in preservation, which is good. We like keeping these whole things around. And 33 were converted into Class 57s, but 51 of the 47s are still in service now. Still working on the British rail lines, even after privatization. These things are pushing 60, and they're still out there trucking away. There are many different versions of them, actually, with slight different modifications, because I think that was one of their best traits, is that they could be modified to do a variety of different things, making them very, very flexible. The reliability certainly helped with that, too, because even when they were modified, they could be expected to work, when a lot of the other diesels, well, couldn't. A good showing from Brush Traction and British Rail, which, when it comes to the 1960s, is not a sentence I get to say very often. So I don't want to hear I can't say a good thing about British Rail ever again, okay? Because I can. It's just, they make it hard sometimes, alright? The NS Class 1300. I want you all to realize what I've been going through lately, and it's very important to me, because I've been waging an internal war in my Discord server against a few fans. They call themselves fans. I'm not even sure they are at this point. They must like me a whole lot and like the content, because they are, well, Dutch. And that's fine. I guess they could take a break from their never-ending war against Poseidon to harass me, though, because they have been demanding persistently, nearly every day, for the last 3 or 4 months, that I talk about Dutch trains. It's imperative that I do this for their sake. Now, I've gotten plenty of requests from people from other countries to talk about trains from their country, and that's fine. I'm totally okay with that, and I actually encourage it. I would love to talk about more other locomotives and trains and other such things from other countries, so if you have a suggestion, feel free to say something, but the Dutch, in particular, at least these few, have chosen to be oddly persistent about this, and I am notorious for not doing what I'm told, purely out of spite, but at the same time, I respect their commitment to their cause, and they actually have been very friendly about the whole thing. So, okay, let's talk about another Dutch locomotive. The Class 1300 was in service for 48 years, from 1952 until 2000. So already, we have an impressive display. These are electric locomotives. They were actually built at the same time as the Class 1100s at Alstom, and they were based off of the SNCF Class CC 7100s. The 1300s at the end of the day are basically just a larger 6-axle CoCo version of the Class 1100s. The first one was delivered in 1952, and they proceeded to remain in service for nearly 50 years. They had a maximum speed of 81 miles per hour, 130 kilometers per hour, with a tractive effort of 54,000 pounds. And though they were withdrawn in the year 2000, in 2015, number 1304 was put back into service for a private operator, HSL Logistic. She actually broke down the following year, but that was due to operator error, not the locomotive itself. She was repaired later in 2018 and deployed by the Fair Trains Foundation. The objective of them is to have museum equipment restored and preserved from the revenues of their use. Interesting idea, and 1304 is supposed to be joined in this task by 1315. Number 1312 is actually another working representative of them for the Dutch Railway Museum, with 1302 serving as a spare part donor. Despite only 16 of them being built, their history, and the fact they lasted so long, I think speaks for itself. And there's much love for them when it comes to the Netherlands, since, well, they're being put back into service in some capacities. That's not a bad showing at all. The Milwaukee Road Class S3. Hey look, another Northern, a 484, and it's Milwaukee Road, who I made a video about because of their considerable failures, but this wasn't one of them. The S3s were really, really, really good. 10 of these were produced between July and September of 1944 by Alco, and they were operated by the Milwaukee Road until the mid-50s, so they only lasted about 10 years. That's not a good showing at face value compared to the longevity of the other locomotives I've had on this list, but you don't understand how good the S3s really were. Their loss had nothing to do with the fact that they were bad at all. It had to do with the fact that Milwaukee Road chose to dieselize like pretty much everybody else did. Technically, they were actually smaller and less powerful than Milwaukee's earlier Class S2s, and they were more like the Class S1s, but they were equipped with roller bearings and the reliability and utility spoke for itself. They could pull pretty much whatever the railroad wanted, with little difficulty, if at all. They were capable of speeds of 100 miles per hour, 160 kilometers per hour, and their tractive effort was 62,119 pounds. That's 276.32 kilonewtons. They were genuinely good, but again, dieselization came into the fold. Milwaukee put them into storage in 1954, but the equipment trusts on them hadn't expired yet, so they couldn't be scrapped or sold. Then, 2 of them eventually wound up being saved in 1956. Milwaukee Road 265 was donated to the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and sat on static display there until 1975. Then she was moved to the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois, where she currently lives. Milwaukee Road 261 had a far more active story, however. She was donated to the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin in 1958. Nowadays, she's owned, operated, and maintained by the Minneapolis-based nonprofit organization Friends of the 261. She's an excursion locomotive, and probably one of the best there's ever been. She was restored to operational condition in 1993, and since then has logged more than 25,000 miles, 40,000 kilometers, under her own power. She's an impressive piece of work, demonstrating the potential of steam technology, as well as just being a great excursion train. People love her, despite not having the flair of the Daylight, or the royal status of 611, or the legendary status of 844. 261 sits in the background, but gets her recognition by performance. Allegedly, she's a joy to work with, and a joy to ride. The last information I have on her shows that there are plans to possibly convert her to oil firing, which isn't something that Milwaukee Road actually hadn't done. 262, 263, 267, and 269, her lost sisters, were all converted to oil at some point. So it's not like this can't be done, and perhaps it would make it more economical to run her in the future. By the way, though, she's got plenty of fans, and is a great representative of just how good Alco was at making steam locomotives. The New South Wales 44 class. 44 class are diesel-electric locomotives that were built by A.E. Goodwin for the New South Wales Department of Railways. They are Australian, and 100 of them were produced between 1957 and 1967. Naturally, based on their appearance, yeah, they were modeled kind of like EMDs, the bulldog nose they got going on, but they're very square. A bit more like Alco's take on that design, actually. Totally on purpose, since these were license-built locomotives based on the Alco DL500Bs. They weren't identical to them, but they were very similar, and they were actually fitted with Alco 12 251B engines. Now, you probably can't tell based on the pictures, but they're actually double-ended. The bulldog nose is on one side, but there is actually a cab in the back, going with typical practice of anywhere that isn't America, of having diesels that are double-ended. It's really normal for everywhere but North America in general. And during their career, which lasted a very, very long time into, now, they pulled every type of train imaginable with success. They were genuinely good diesels, and did the job that the railway needed. Some started being withdrawn in the 80s, but many survived into the 90s in regular service, with the last one being withdrawn in July of 1997. But I already said that some are still in service, and it's off and on, actually. Most of them wound up scrapped, because, yeah, that's about normal, but several are still in preservation. 2 are in storage, and 2 are considered operational. The ones that are operational are sometimes sent on loan for mainline duties when other railways need extra power. They still occasionally do actual regular service work outside of their homes on preserved railways, which is a great display of excellence for locomotives that are over 50 years old. The FS Class 691. Italy, I got you. I got you guys. I got you. I totally went out of my way to make sure I got a good locomotive from Italy. Based on direct request. My Italian fans wanted a good locomotive from their country. I got you! Mr. Worldwide, remember? The 691 is a class of Pacific locomotives, 462s, that were actually rebuilds based off of Class 690. Class 690s weren't very good because they were poor steamers due to a small firebox. Very Henry of them, actually. But it was thought that this could be corrected, and the result was the 691. And they were great. Once the rebuilds were conducted, the 691s proved excellent. They're actually the fastest and most powerful steam locomotives ever built for Italian railways. And they were mostly used to pull the heaviest and fastest express trains, which they did flawlessly. 3 of them were lost during World War II, but the rest still carried on until the early 60s when they were finally withdrawn. There were 33 members of this class of locomotive, however, only 1 wound up in preservation. That single example is 691.022, which is on static display at the that in Milan. It's in Milan. You can find it after that. I can read Leonardo da Vinci. Does that help? I got you there. DSB Class MY. These are another class of diesel-electric locomotives that were built between 1954 and 1965 by NOHAB, a manufacturing company based in Sweden. 59 units were built in total and were delivered to the Danish State Railways. They're actually powered by EMD engines, and signaled a significant change in their rolling stock policy over there. See, for a long time, motive power had been sourced within Denmark, so NOHAB based the diesels off of more American practice and powered them with EMD engines. And the result was actually quite excellent. 59 were built in total, alongside another class, the MXs, which were lighter and intended to replace steam on branch lines. The MYs were the main line diesels. They lasted until 2001, and by that I mean technically 2010, because the Danish State Railways kept one unit around, 1135, to run a special train. Then she was handed over to the Danish Railway Museum in Odense to haul heritage trains along with her sister, 1101. A fine class of locomotive all around, but I can't get over their appearance. Yeah, they got that bulldog nose, but they just look so surprised all the time. Like, I guess it's because I'm human and we like to see faces and things, but, I mean, look at it. It looks like an EMD that just got scared by a mouse or something. Oh goodness, what was that? Oh! But they were great locomotives either way. The Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Class 5s. These were tank engines, 242Ts, built in the United Kingdom, and introduced in 1889. They were not withdrawn until 1961. They lasted that long, but it wasn't without good reason. The UK, in particular, was always really good at tank engines, and the Class 5s are a perfect example of that ability. 310 of these little guys were produced, and they were exceptional at what they were for. They were, in fact, adapted into the Class 6s, which were built between 1911 and 1914. A total of 64 of them wound up being produced, with 44 of that being rebuilt of the Class 5s. In service, these locomotives allegedly suffered zero teething troubles, and they gained a reputation for handling some of the most difficult routes that the network had. And like I said, they continued to be worked heavily right up until the end of steam entirely. Only one of these amazing locomotives wound up preserved, number 1008, which was actually the first Class 5 engine to be built. It was withdrawn in 1954 after 65 years of service, and it's now on static display at the National Railway Museum. The Zero Series Shinkansen. You know, I have gotten a lot of people that have been wanting me to mention this. And yes, it is Japanese. And yes, it is that Japanese train. The Japanese train. The Shinkansen train sets were built to run on Japan's high-speed line, which opened in 1964. The Zero Series was ambitious and bold, and really no one ever thought it could work outside of Japan. During the time this was being developed, in terms of short distance travel, cars were the answer. In terms of long distance, it was planes. That's what the world thought. A lot of people thought that trains didn't really have much of a place outside of possible regional service for people that didn't own cars or couldn't afford them. But the Shinkansen Zero Series changed that mentality entirely by introducing a train that was so fast that it could in fact outcompete airplanes. It was too fast for a car to compete with, and it was fast enough where even though some planes could go faster, if you factor in the time it takes to get on the plane and take off and land and get back to the gate and the whole thing, and then there's security and modern day and everything else that goes along with air travel, yeah, the train was way faster, and it was cheaper to operate, and therefore was more affordable to consumers. Shinkansen was amazingly successful, allowing people to get around the country at a pace no one had ever considered before. And they got the rest of the world paying attention, and other countries scrambled to introduce their own high-speed trains. In service, the Zero Series lasted for 44 years, and there's quite a few preserved examples of them sitting in places all over Japan. It's a cultural highlight, an astonishing symbol of progress for a country that was ravaged by the horrors of World War II, and helped lead them to become a technological powerhouse in terms of modern tech development. And don't think they're done with trains, oh no, because now they got the maglevs. I'm not sure I could put the maglev on this list at the moment because, well, it doesn't run on rails, so some people don't even call it a regular train, though it is still technically a train, and I just don't think it's been long enough for it to have been proven as best ever. But it is working, even when a lot of other people said it wouldn't. So, you know, how about we just stop underestimating Japan's technical prowess? How about that? I think that's a good idea, because they always prove us wrong in this department. The Southern Pacific GS4. Yeah, I've been getting this requested a lot, and I've been a little reluctant to put it on the list because, okay, the GS4 is iconic. It is a good type of locomotive, but the success of the GS5 was much better. Why the GS4 though? Well, what the GS4 lacks in terms of power output and speed and everything, it makes up for in legacy. GS4s were streamlined 484 locomotives, and they worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad Company from 1941 to 1958. They were built by Lima Locomotive Works, and they were designed to be a good, all-around type of steam locomotive. The thing about the GS4s, and a lot of the GSs to be frank, is that they were never really exceptional at any one thing. They weren't as fast as Hudsons, they weren't as powerful as FEFs, but the GS4s were so flexible. And I think that was one of their biggest strengths overall. You could put them on pretty much any kind of train, and they'd be fine at it. Now, they were designed for passenger service initially, but they wound up being reassigned to freight trains and were perfectly fine at that. But sadly, like every steam locomotive, they couldn't escape the impending dieselization of America's rail lines, and 27 of the 28 were scrapped. The 28th, number 4449, is the only surviving member of the class, and to be honest, it's probably one of the most recognizable locomotives of all time. Why is that? Well, look at it. It's orange. In fact, the GS4s were often painted orange. It was known as the Daylight paint scheme, and 4449 pulls what's known as the Daylight Express. She originally sat on static display at the Oaks Amusement Park, but that was until 1974 when she was removed from that spot and went to undergo restoration. She pulled the American Freedom Train from 1975 to 1976, and she's still operational to this day, currently residing at the Oregon Rail Heritage Center in Portland, Oregon. The EMC EAEB. Okay, right off the bat, serious question. What the heck is an EMC? What about EMD? Well, EMC, Electromotive Corporation, was what EMD originally went by. Now, these diesels were actually the first of EMD's E units, the cousins of the F units. So basically, the EA/EBs are the original sources of dieselization in America. They were 1,800 horsepower, meant to operate in pairs, one A unit and one B unit. The difference was the B units didn't have any cabs, and were just meant to boost the operation of the A units. Only 6 of each was ever produced, but they were built specifically for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Back then, the design ethos for EMC's diesel locomotives was to produce them specifically for each railway, making each design individual and distinctive for each railway's needs. Eventually they stopped doing this, realizing that a more general assembly line style diesel was a lot more lucrative. But despite that, the EAs and the EBs were really good. You have to remember they were built in 1937, very old for diesel standards, but they could travel up to 99 miles per hour. Only one was ever able to enter preservation. B&O number 51, which was the first EA built, is preserved at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in, well, Baltimore, Maryland. The Reading T1. Not to be confused with every other T1 that was ever designed when it comes to locomotives. I don't know why there were so many T1s. There were at least 4 that I am aware of. Was a class of 484 Northern type steam locomotives owned by the Reading Company. And they're an odd choice for this list because they're technically rebuilds. They were designed from 30 of the I-10 SAs, which were 280 consolidation type locomotives. The reason they did this is they needed a more powerful type of steam locomotive, but due to World War II and even the post-war economy, designing one from scratch would have been very expensive and difficult. So they figured they'd try to remodel some of their old ones, and the result was the T1. And they were exceptional, actually. Probably one of the best steam locomotives ever to run on American rail lines. Right up there with the Niagaras and the FEFs. Their primary purpose was fast freight service, which they were exceptional at. But they had been assigned to passenger trains as well, which they handled beautifully. But sadly, they didn't even last 10 years, and that was due to, again, dieselization. They were out of service by 1954. Precisely 4 are still preserved: 2100, 2101, 2102, and 2124. The NS Class 1200, a class of electric locomotive built between 1951 and 1953 for the Nederlandse Spoorwagen. I still love that name. They were actually designed by Baldwin, believe it or not, which might explain why they look a little bulldog nosy like American diesels of that era tended to be. But they were built by Workspoor, a Dutch machine factory. The construction process for this one was a little weird because some of the parts were actually constructed in the United States. The reason for this is that these locomotives were one of the direct products of the Marshall Plan. What was the Marshall Plan? Well, it was an American initiative that was enacted in 1948 in response to the economic situation in Western Europe. See, as you might imagine, World War II kind of decimated Europe. A significant portion of the fighting was there, and after the war was over, people needed to rebuild, but that's easier said than done. The continental United States was pretty much untouched by the war, but Western Europe was still suffering, trying to pick up the pieces of everything they had lost, so the Marshall Plan was meant to help alleviate that. $13 billion in economic recovery programs were sent specifically to benefit Western Europe, and one of them wound up producing the Class 1200. And these were phenomenal electric locomotives. They entered service in 1951 and weren't retired till 1998! That's an insane longevity! And that was just under Nederlandse Spoorwagen. ACTS Nederland BV continued to use 5 of them in freight and charter service until 2010. And other smaller railways continued to use them until 2017. They're an incredible piece of work. The British Rail Class 91. What's that, you say? What? More British... No! Oh, no! Do I want more British Rail? No, of course I do. Why would you ever think that? But I guess that's happening anyway. I don't even know why you asked the question. You know I have no choice about it. Class 91 is a high-speed electric locomotive. 31 of them were produced between 1988 and 1991, and they're also known as the Intercity 225. During their development, they were called Electras, and much of the design work that went into these was actually based off their experience with the APT. Despite what you may think of the APT, the Class 91s are incredible pieces of work. They were reliable, the train sets were comfortable, and more specifically, they were fast. 91010, which has now been renumbered to 91110, actually holds the British locomotive speed record, which it set on the 17th of September 1989 by traveling 161.7 miles per hour, or 260.2 kilometers per hour. Technically, other classes, the 370s, 373s, and 374s, have all traveled faster, but they are EMUs. Class 91 is a locomotive, so it's officially the fastest locomotive in Britain. Sadly, it's unclear how long the Class 91s still have. The withdrawal process for them was started in 2019, but 12 of them are currently still in service and 12 are stored. Only 4 have been scrapped. The reason the withdrawal is taking so long is that many of the new types that were supposed to replace them are not very good. We've talked about them. So the 91s can't be done away with. And to be fair, hey, they work. They're great, in fact. So, if you can't find something that's better, then I would say just keep using the 91s. I think that's a good idea. It's literally one of the best things you guys ever did. I'm just saying. Maybe not throw it away like that. Till next time, this is Darkness, and bid you all a fond farewell.